Chapter 3, 8th and 9th grade, Fall Term 2005 to Spring Term 2007. 8th grade. The beef with this guy kept going during 8th grade. One thing that bothered me quite a lot, and can nowadays at least keep me wondering why, was that I had to have several classes with him, despite the fact that he went to 9th grade. The other 9th graders didn't have any of these classes, besides news analysis, where we would review each of our own news article of choice. That meant I got to have news analysis with the 9th graders instead of the other 8th graders. I also had more classes with this guy than the other 8th graders. At the time I assumed I had so many classes with this guy because the teachers wanted him to keep bullying me. The only difference was that this time, he did it during class instead of recess. Nowadays I can't call it bullying. It was rather me actually who took it too far that route. We just had beef, that's all. Besides that, I can't decide why I had to have class with him. The notion that the teachers wanted him to bully me is only a conspiracy theory that I stopped believing in a long time ago. As a result of the beef, I started switching chairs every time this guy sat beside me and laughing every time he made a mistake during gym class. Consequently, I had 2 meetings with the head teacher, the guy and the school welfare officer, school counselor maybe. During both meetings, I was accused of what I'd done. Rightfully so, but I never got a chance to explain or defend myself. That made me angry at the officer also. I remember her saying I was breaking the law, which really wasn't the case here. But still, I was quote, criminalized for these minuscule misdemeanors, let alone the computer rules. During the second meeting, the head teacher told me I'd be forced to apologize to the guy if I ever did anything quote, wrong, again. He also told me he would lock me out of the classroom, again. Being forced to apologize for something I didn't actually regret was pretty much my life's greatest fear at the time, and I'll get back to why. I remember crying in my own room after the second meeting. I felt that the head teacher had shown himself to be real cold-hearted, and that he was really on the other guy's side of this beef. That made me hate his guts. Whatever he had done before was minuscule compared to this, and this was also minuscule compared to what was next. I would surely learn that. As of today, this is a small thing, but back then it was something totally different. Then of course I was wrong for bullying him. I wasn't wrong for being mad at him, like I even had a choice at that, but I should have crossed over to doing more useful things than what I did, which he couldn't have prevented me from. I also remember writing quite often on the whiteboard in the ASP classroom during this period. I can't remember anything I wrote, but I do remember writing mostly about the computer rules and my beef with this guy. It was always removed shortly after. Obviously not today's Instagram. They suggested that I instead should go play video games in the Oasis, a recreational hall at the school where you could find a soccer table, a pool table, video games, an ice cream stand, etc. I tried it of course, but got tired after about an hour or so. First off, the games, mainly sports games, were totally uninteresting, and being surrounded by a bunch of normal youth, none of which I knew, was like a war zone for me at the time. Although a worthy challenge I should have accepted willingly in preparation for the future. One time, the head teacher was joking about another kid's obsession with pigs, I mean actual animal pigs, not cops, and then he directly switched to joking about my future plans, which at that time was to move to New York City and become a rapper. I had just given up that dream I had about founding a rap duo with Andy Milonakis, but not the rest. Here we had the head teacher comparing my relatively serious future plans with something as pathetic as that other kid's obsession with pigs. Talk about degrading an ambitious teenager. He probably never thought that all of these small things from my early childhood would take me this far in life. Yeah, really, who would have thought? One time I had a discussion with the head teacher about my parents, which I'd had some minor issues with the last year. I can't remember much other than saying, but Eminem hates his mom. Then he said, but he grew up in a trailer with an alcoholic mother who beat him, so he was much worse off than you. He sounded strict and somewhat nasal/falsetto-like in his voice when he said that. I became scared and numb at that time. I became totally silent, not saying a word. I got angry at him for not caring about my problems, like they weren't big enough. But I also agreed with him that I had it quote, too good, which made me feel inadequate and pathetic. Quite often during junior high, he told me how I had it quote, so good, just for living in the suburbs with a nuclear, white middle-class family, with the potential intention to make me feel pathetic like I was just whining about small things. Indeed, I had relatively small problems at home, and even at school. But all that I went through in 5th grade was real significant though. The big problem all along though was just that I had ASP, and thus no friends and no outdoors activities, and thus seemingly an utterly dark future. By the way, Eminem didn't spend his entire childhood in one and the same trailer. He moved around a lot, living in both white trailer parks and black ghettos during his childhood. During this fall, I wanted GTA San Andreas for Christmas. Both of my parents were strongly opposed to that, since they decided I was way too young and that the game was way too violent. I was devastated since I wanted that game so bad. The reason for that was that since early childhood, I'd wanted to be able to drive around a city and step out of the car and walk around on foot, which I couldn't do in any other driving game. That's why I wanted it so bad. The violence wasn't interesting at all, since I already had plenty of access to just as harsh violence through other games, movies and videos. 2 other reasons I wanted San Andreas was that all the 3 cities in the game were all on the same map, unlike other games where I had to switch city/map by the menu. Also, hip-hop culture was a big part of San Andreas, much due to the main character being a young black male from the hood. I already had plenty of driving games since early childhood due to my strong interest in cars. Put that aside, I'd been open to all kinds of games until my teens. Now I focused on more advanced games, especially so-called sandboxes, where you could drive around and perhaps even walk around entire cities. I'd always preferred driving safely around traffic rather than speeding around a one-way track, and I'd also tried doing that with all these Need for Speed games. During junior high, my family bought all computer and video games from the game store Tradition, owned by EB Games, located in downtown Umeå. The reason for that was the only video game store we knew that allowed us to return the game within the first week and get all the money back. The Tradition staff didn't allow my parents to buy the game for me since they demanded me being at least 16. The game was rated 18 by PEGI, the European Video Game Age Rating System, similar to ESRB. By that time, I'd already learned that age ratings didn't always fit the game or movie. Take 8 Mile for example, which was rated R, age 17, in the US by MPAA but only 11 in Sweden. It should have been rated 15, which I already noticed the first time I watched it. I'm only glad I got to watch it that early in life. It was a whole lot better than that chat site, considering both vocabulary and maturity/normalization function, but 11 was still a very inappropriate rating. Sweden has its own movie age rating system, while PEGI goes for pretty much entire Europe. The Swedish age ratings are ages 3, 7, 11 and 15. San Andreas was rated M, age 17, by ESRB, similar to 16 by PEGI. But yet the game was rated 18 by PEGI for some reason. All of this happened before that hot coffee mod came out, which led to the game being rated adults only, age 18 what else, by ESRB. Fortunately, my parents never found out about the hot coffee mod. I remember running away from home one evening during December. I went to Mom's old apartment complex a bit away from home like I did back in elementary. My parents had reunited by now, but they separated again later. I spent some time there crying about my situation, both at home and at school. Then right before Christmas Eve, I was told that even if my parents would have accepted the game, they still wouldn't have been allowed by the Tradition staff to buy it. That instantly saved my Christmas Eve. But I was still disappointed about not getting the game. Until now, hip-hop had only been a fun interest, just like profanity and fictional violence. But now I started to take it a lot more serious. Now I started to wish I was neurotypical, not disabled that is, so that I wouldn't have to go to a special class. I also started to wish I grew up in the ghetto, since hip-hop had taught me that ghetto kids hate snitches, which I thought this guy was, as well as authorities such as teachers, cops and the government. I also had this perception that ghetto kids remain cool, throughout adulthood. They wouldn't turn out boring, when they become adults like middle and upper class kids. I had all these adults, rappers, teachers, relatives etc., as reference and I was worried that my will would be broken with age. I didn't wish necessarily though that I was racialized. I didn't feel as if that was necessary since I already then knew that minorities could be middle and upper class while whites could be lower and working class. The ending scene of 8 Mile played a big part in this. Eminem's character, Jimmy B. Rabbit Smith Jr., was a poor white guy living in a trailer park with his alcoholic mother. Papa Doc, the black guy Jimmy battled against over the shook one's beat, lived with his happily married parents in some wealthy suburb. On top of that, he went to Cranbrook, that's a private school. Jimmy, who had been constantly underestimated solely for being white, used his white trash background and Papa Doc's so-called black bourgeois background, which he had kept secret until then, to defeat him, leaving him speechless, quote, choking. Thanks to this, I felt no need to be racialized. I just wanted to be from the hood, and neurotypical. But since I was a disabled kid from the burbs, I started to feel inadequate, pathetic and worthless. At least that's what I blamed for my newly found inferiority complex. Until then, I'd been just fine with myself, totally unconcerned about my circumstances, identity or future. Another reason for wanting to be from the hood was that I was disappointed in my parents for not letting me have San Andreas. That plus other relatively small problems at home in the ASP class made me wish I was from the hood so that I wouldn't be, quote, trapped in this middle-class environment. My idea was that if my parents were poor, they would have truly cared about me, or I would have had bigger problems at home such as substance abuse, domestic violence, etc. The purpose of that was to be taken seriously, instead of being disowned as a spoiled, whiny, suburban brat. That's how I'd started to see myself now. As a result of all that, I decided I was gonna lie about my childhood as an adult. I was gonna pretend that I grew up in some hood in Stockholm. But I also wanted revenge on the head teacher and this guy, so therefore I had to somehow include the ASP class in my fictional story. I remember coming up with a solution. I grew up in the hood in Stockholm, but during junior high I had to commute between Umeå and Stockholm daily, just to go to the ASP class in Umeå for some reason. I can't possibly remember how I expected people to actually believe that. I don't blame myself one bit for being ashamed of having ASP, but I already knew that I could hide it in the future by behavior. There were also a few kids in the class who behaved quite normally. I remember especially a guy who was a big fan of heavy metal and all its subgenres. Then during 9th grade, we had a visit from a former student who had become an adult and had been working abroad, and who also behaved fully normally. If they could, I could. But I find it hard nowadays to understand why I was ashamed of being middle class. Obviously I was only right for not wanting to end up like my parents and teachers, but I already had role models who grew up middle class and still kept their will alive throughout their adulthoods. First I had my assistant during 5th grade. I have no idea though how he turned out later in life. Then I also had Swedish rapper Petter, who grew up in Södermalm in downtown Stockholm where I was born. The head teacher also showed me the book, American Pictures, that I could find in the ASP classroom, written by Jacob Holt, who grew up in a small town in Denmark and who then wandered and took photos around the entire US for years, living mainly with poor people, of different skin colors, but also rich people sometimes. These 3 people should have been enough to make me realize that I never had to hide my middle-class background, that I only had to be, or at least seem, normal. Then I never would have had to switch city or family in my fictional childhood. The ASP class would have obviously still been a problem due to my lust for revenge, but a false diagnose, like the one I had until 6th grade, probably would have worked. The head teacher would also question my skewed worldview the coming years, and rightfully so. One time during a social studies class, he made a real good comparison between 2 fictional teenage boys. One was a racialized kid from the hood Tensta in northwest Stockholm whose parents had full-time jobs and were present, and thus he kept away from criminality and drugs. The other one was a rich white guy from affluent Djursholm in northern Stockholm, whose parents were too busy working, and thus he became a criminal and an addict. That should have helped me think a little better. The head teacher does deserve props for this one. He had also tipped me about the rap duo Block 44 from Oldham here in Umeå since a few months back. In combination with that, I found this SVD article in about the winter of 2007, in 9th grade, written in January 2004. To my surprise, it's still intact as of 2021. The article's titled, Hip Hop Turns White Guys into Cool Outsiders, and described my reality perfectly, as a white middle-class guy who liked hip-hop and wanted to be from the hood, and thus very much racialized also. The problem was just that shame, plus the fear that, quote, I would end up at a well-paying job, having thrown that black mask away in the gutter, like the end of the article says it. At first I simply had no confidence in Block. I was too busy with rappers from down south in Sweden and overseas. But here I had two new role models, from my very own city. I also remember the head teacher once saying that Block actually came from Innertavle, a small village a bit east of Ullidhem. That explained why they perhaps actually were middle class. This article also explains perfectly a global reason for my shame, guilt and fear. That I was considered myself to be a wannabe, a wigger. That I could never be quote, real, authentic. This would catch up with me more and more the coming years, in connection to getting to know people, not in connection to continued loneliness. I find this very comparable to the dekulakization that went on under the Soviet Union, something we've seen a lot of in recent years through Black Lives Matter, the woke movement and critical race theory. Evidently a major root cause of many of today's right-wing populist Sweden Democrats and Trump supporters, and why I myself was close to ending up there. If you ain't allowed to relate to and feel empathy for minorities, you'll go elsewhere. My revengefulness and future plans made me use the computer very differently, both at home and at school. At first I was only interested in fictional violence, but now I was interested in hip-hop, ghettos and other more serious subjects. I started studying hip-hop, ghettos, African American history among other things. The big upside to all this was that I wasn't held back by the computer rules or the child security at home any longer. It didn't bother me as much from now on. This gave me much more computer freedom. On top of the fact that nobody and nothing prevented me from my new computer habits, it all started with me doing these forbidden, taboo things that wasn't actually any more useful than what others did, minigames, multiplayer etc. I also did a lot of that myself besides breaking the computer rules. The difference was that I became an outcast due to that and the beef, and thus really got ahead later with no obstacles at all. It's kind of like choosing the so-called death drug, cannabis over alcohol, quote, as normal as that is, and then crossing over to Islam, where all drugs are forbidden, even alcohol. Just like I actually did as an adult. On my 15th birthday I was given the game Driver 3, rated age 16. Just like in San Andreas, I could drive around a city and also get out of the car and walk around on foot. At least I got that wish come true. But I still had to switch city by the menu. I couldn't drive directly between the cities through the countryside like in San Andreas. On top of all that, the main character was a white middle-aged undercover cop, so I wasn't quite satisfied yet. But I was also given the game Mafia the following fall, who was obviously about the Italian-American mafia in the 1930s. One good step closer to San Andreas, also because there was a countryside. The remaining problem though was that there was only one city. Since I had ASP, computer and video games became much bigger for me than they actually were. Through those games, I could easily escape this reality as a lonely, anxious child and suddenly become adult and confident, and also strapped, armed that is. The character's skin color, class background or occupation was less relevant. Had I been normal, computer and video games hadn't been half as important, and at the same time I probably would have had access to stuff through friends that my parents didn't allow. I did get to sneak test a little San Andreas at a young relative's house. Sometime during this year, between the spring and the fall, I was given a personal assistant, a white guy around age 20 at the time who I met about once a month. We went and did stuff like going to the movies, playing pool, being at his house, meeting his family etc. I'd had a number of assistants since age 12 I think, but this one I had until the summer of 2009, around the time I turned 18. 9th grade. During this fall, I visited Hartvigsgården, called Harton for short, on a few Monday evenings. Harton is a youth center located in Griesbacka right to the east of Grubbe. On Mondays, only disabled kids were let in, while other nights were open for anybody including disabled. I was there a few times by myself back in 7th grade with a personal assistant, mostly to play video games. I can't remember any specific day of the week from back then. After having been there like 3 times this fall, I got a little skeptical whether I should stay there or not. Then during my like 5th, 6th visit, this guy that I had beef with suddenly showed up out of nowhere. He had just started high school, and I hadn't seen him at Harton earlier. I never thought I would see him again, but I was wrong. His presence made me leave that very second without thinking twice, but not simply because of him, but rather because I'd also realized that Harton wasn't good for me. I'd realized I shouldn't spend any free time with the disabled. It was bad enough already going to the ASP class. After leaving Harton, I got laughed at by the head teacher a few times because of my decision. I remember him calling me a coward a number of times. I remember the first time quite clearly. He stood suddenly with his legs a bit bent, pointed straight at me and said, "Coward," twice in a row with his nasal/falsetto-like voice. Now when I'd started 9th grade, I thought the ASP class would be better now since the guy was gone. For the same reason, I got somewhat more included and sucked into the ASP class. But after having met him once again, I realized that the ASP class was no better than before. That made me hate the ASP class, as well as the ASP culture, even more. Thanks to Harton, I learned about this subculture surrounding ASP. It made me more outcasted from the ASP class, which was only right since that pushed me harder and strengthened my will when it came to wanting to be a neurotypical ghetto kid. That's why I would have been better off if this guy would have stayed this school year. That would have made me even more of an outcast. During the same period, I found the site nobodysmiling.com where I found loads of old hip-hop videos from the 80s and 90s. Thanks to that site, I learned a lot more about hip-hop and all the old rappers from back then. I also started to notice a quite obvious contrast between quote, real, and fake hip-hop. Real hip-hop was usually from the 80s and 90s, often contained samples and the lyrics were about ghetto life, social issues and politics. Fake hip-hop was usually from the double O's, rarely contained samples and the lyrics were about sex, materialism, fame and wealth. Already then, if not earlier, I learned to dislike fake hip-hop just like I'd previously learned to dislike mainstream pop music, like the music my family listened to. That would add to some continued, but on the other hand dignified, loneliness many years ahead. Sometime this fall, I and my dad visited Tradition. I wanted more than one game but of course I only got to choose one. I first chose San Andreas of course, but got rejected because the staff decided it was too violent. Then I asked if True Crime New York City and 50 Cent Bulletproof were okay, but then I also got rejected. Then the staff recommended Gun. We bought it because there was nothing else that interested me other than the games I just mentioned. All of these 4 games had an age limit of 18. It made me wonder why they approved Gun and not the other games. They just said Gun was not as violent as the others. The rest I had to wait for until my 16th birthday the following summer, they decided. Already then I saw that the commonalities among the first 3 games are quite clear. In all those games, the main character's a young black man, and all those games take place in contemporary urban environments, where there are ghettos of course. In Gun on the other hand, the main character's a slightly older white man, who turns out to be half Native American later in the game, and the game takes place in the sparse countryside of the western United States during the 1880s. A typical Wild West environment in other words. There could be no other reason why they approved Gun but not the other games. They approved a game where the main character's a white man in a Wild West environment, but not 3 other games with the same age limit where the main characters were young black men in contemporary urban environments. It couldn't be anything but pure, uncut racism. It made me lose respect for the staff at Tradition more than I already had. However, I said nothing about this to my parents, because I saw no use in it. Then on my 16th birthday I got San Andreas. After playing it for a while I noticed that it was actually less violent than Gun. In Gun you could shoot people's heads off, and also find loose heads on the ground. In addition, you could scalp people, which wasn't strange since the main character was half native. After the scalping you could see the brain. In San Andreas you could only shoot people's heads off. You couldn't find loose heads on the ground, only headless bodies. I definitely couldn't see anyone's brain, or intestines for that matter. That made it even clearer why the staff at Tradition approved Gun but not the other games. What else did they have to go by? The day before graduation in mid-June, I got into a discussion with several teachers in the ASP class. It was mainly about that guy. I can also remember the head teacher saying I was only making it worse for myself by holding a grudge against him. Then he went on to say that I would never develop if I kept holding it. I agree that you shouldn't have grudges. But you can't just choose it away, turn it off. Thus the correct term is, have a grudge, not hold. But I also firmly believe it's the grudge that made me develop better than the other kids in the class, along with the alienation, breaking the computer rules and then crossing over to better things. Everything I went through during 5th grade also made me develop better, and it was really my new hip-hop interest, my new assistant, and running away from school constantly for disliking my new teacher and missing my old one. This would only be more confirmed through the years.